Before September 5th, 1982, I was a homemaker, housewife, mother. I lived what I've considered to be a normal, happy life, doing things with my kids, going to ball games, baking cookies, doing all the mom things. And then on September 5th, my entire world blew apart when someone kidnapped my son, Johnny, while he was delivering his Sunday morning papers in West Des Moines, Iowa. That morning started out very early for him, like any other day. He left the house at about 5:45 in the morning. He headed down the street pulling his little wagon and our dog riding along with him. He got as far as the corner, about a block from our home, when a man stopped him and asked for directions. Johnny was always instructed not to talk to strangers, so he didn't go over to the car and spend time. The other kids at the corner, who were the witnesses, were the ones that reported all of this to me. As Johnny walked away from this man, the man suddenly made a U-turn in the middle of the street with his car and sped back up the street and pulled in right where all the boys were gathering their papers, folding them, and preparing to deliver their own routes. The man shut off the engine to the car, opened the passenger door, and slid his feet out onto the curb and started talking to all the boys. He spoke with a very slurred speech pattern, according to what I was told by the witnesses. Johnny turned to one of the witnesses, Mike, who was 16, and he said, "This man is nuts. There's something wrong with him. I'm scared and I'm leaving." Johnny threw all his papers into the wagon and took off down the street. The other boys that were at the corner at that time also left. There was a 44-year-old attorney that had pulled up with his car to grab his son's papers, and he had paid attention to the man and the license plate, but didn't know that a crime was about to occur, and he left. Johnny, as he was walking down the street, was just minding his own business when Mike heard our little dog growl. At that very moment, the man who had driven up in the car suddenly pulled himself back in the car, slammed the door, started the engine, and then reached up with his hand and clicked the dome light 3 times. At that very moment, Mike looked down the street after Johnny, saw Johnny walking along, and then saw another man come out between 2 houses and follow my son. The man was about 6'3" and stayed about a half a block behind Johnny. I doubt very much that my son even knew he was being followed. He then went around the corner, out of the direct eyesight of Mike. A few seconds later, Mike heard a car door slam, the screeching of tires, and he saw that very same car that had been at the corner where he was sitting earlier run the stop sign, turn left, which was north, and head straight towards the interstate, which is out of town. This all took place in approximately 12 minutes from the time my son left home. At the time, we were asleep. His father and I were home asleep. We did not know our son was kidnapped. Normally, the routine would have been for Johnny to come in and wake up his father to go with him on the paper route. That morning, for some reason that I do not know today, Johnny did not come in and get his dad. He went on the route alone. That was the only morning in over 13 months of him having the route that he ever did the paper route alone. His dad had always been with him. Our nightmare just exploded. The phone began to ring. Neighbors didn't get their papers. Johnny's father, said, "I'll go and help him. He must be just running late." He left the house, came roaring back in the driveway a few minutes later, and said, "Call the police immediately. Johnny's gone. Somebody took him." His wagon was sitting up on the street corner, full of papers. Not even the bundle ties had been cut. I called the police and reported that we had a missing child. It took them 45 minutes before they ever showed up at our home. In that 45 minutes, I got busy on the phone and I called for my other two children to come home. One was working at a pancake house. The other was at college in a nearby town. And I knew that it was serious. I knew we had to gather our family together. I called friends all around town, asking them to begin to search for my son. I called the Des Moines Register district manager for our area, Johnny's direct superior. She came over to the house and brought the names of all the boys and everyone that would have been at that paper drop site that morning. I called every one of them. By the time the police got to my home, I had a full description of the man, I had a description of the car, a partial license plate number, and every detail that every witness could remember. When the police got there, I filled out the missing persons report and signed it, and the cop looked at me and said, "Did your son ever run away before?" And I said, "He's never run away, period. Why would you say such a thing? Didn't you just listen to me when I told you what the witnesses had said?" And he became a little disgruntled, the fact that I would even utter a question or a statement like that. And he said he had to go back to the station. He left our home, and it was now about 8:30 in the morning. We did not see another representative of the police department until 3 in the afternoon. We were on our own. We organized search parties. We had contacted the media. We asked for help from the public. Thousands of people came forward in West Des Moines and formed search parties and searched the state parks, searched cornfields, searched everything around the area where one might think a violent crime could have occurred and perhaps a body might have been dumped if Johnny had been murdered. At one point, 20 of the searchers came back to the house, furious, angry. They came to the door and said, "I thought you wanted help." And I said, "I do want help. What's wrong?" And they told me that our police chief showed up at one of the state parks, drunk, got up on top of a picnic table, and shouted through a bullhorn, a loudspeaker, for everyone to go home because Johnny Gosch was nothing but a damn runaway. That police chief is no longer in office. His name was Orville Cooney, and he was shamed and had to leave office and was later arrested for shoplifting. So his character was not anything of a sterling nature to begin with. But that was the first big red flag that took place on our case. The fact that the police weren't going to look. We were on our own. At that point, I thought, well, the FBI is supposed to come in on the case. They always did on the FBI story with that from Jim Zimbalist Jr. So I called the FBI office. They did send 2 agents to my home. They sat at the table slurping down coffee and explained to me that they would not enter the case because basically they had no crime. And I looked at them and said, "I have no son. What are you going to do about it?" And they said the police chief had told them that this case did not require the FBI and they were not to be in the case. Day turned into night and into the next day and into the next night with nothing but confusion and absolute turmoil. Our phone rang every 15 minutes, day and night. We had tremendous press coverage. All of the local stations began to show Johnny's picture, and the news began to spread throughout Iowa and to other states that a young boy had been ripped off the street. Still, the police were still waiting 72 hours to act. And I can remember walking into the police station and asking the police chief that if there had been a bank robbery, would they have called it runaway money? for the first 72 hours? Or would they have begun to work on it? Well, he didn't have an answer for me, but did ask me to leave the station. At that point, I knew that no matter what we did, it would have to be our own efforts to find our son, that we were not going to get the help from the police. So I began doing a thorough search, calling people, asking for recommendations for a private investigator. I got several names, and within a week or two, I was already out interviewing private investigators to take the case. One man did agree to take the case, and we brought him to Des Moines and began to do the preliminary things to start an investigation for a missing child. The second day that the man was on the job, he was going to set a surveillance at the site where Johnny was kidnapped at the same time of the morning to watch local traffic and cars. 2 squad cars pulled up from the West Des Moines Police Department and arrested my private investigator and tried to charge him with vagrancy for just sitting there. I could see that they weren't going to accept the idea of a private investigator on the case either. So I went to the police chief and I said, if you're not going to work on my son's case, that's your choice. But step aside because I am. And I informed him that I did not want to see or hear again that my private investigators would be disturbed or arrested. They were licensed in Iowa to operate, and he had fair warning to back off if he was not going to do the job. He decided to back off. He didn't do the job either, but I had good investigators, and we began to gather information. One very important piece of information that we did get came from an interview. The private investigator brought in associates from his office, spread them out in a radius from our home, and they did house-to-house interviews. During one of the interviews, one of the neighbors told him that he had seen a van parked the wrong direction on the street with the motor running, and it was a loud engine. So it caught his attention, and he watched for a little while out the window, and he saw a car pull up next to the van and saw that 2 men were loading something long wrapped in a blanket from the car to the van, and then they all jumped into their vehicles and drove away. He thought it was odd at the time, but at the time he did not know a kidnapping had just happened a few blocks away. We kept that information. We did not share it with law enforcement. And I did that for a reason. Because I knew that someday somebody was going to come forward with that piece of information. And if it had not been broadcast through the media, in newspapers, magazines, or any other way, then I would know that that person was telling the truth. It took many years of leads, disappointments, things that we thought would pan out to be the culmination of the case, that we would get our son back, only to be disappointed. It was like a roller coaster. It took 9 long years, and finally, one day, a young man who had been through torturous hell, who had been abused sexually, had been part of a pornography and prostitution ring, was accused of perjury and sex crimes, was sitting in jail. He confided to his attorney, John DeCamp, from Lincoln, Nebraska, that he had taken part in the Johnny Gosch kidnapping. John DeCamp thought, whoa, that's a big case. I better notify the parents. So he called our home, and I happened to be away that night. I was working, and my husband, at the time, my ex-husband, took the call. He went to Omaha, Nebraska to visit with John DeCamp and to meet Paul Benassi.